This is the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 16th chapter. Jesus said, "There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, 'Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tongue of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames.' But Abraham said, 'Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us is a great chasm that has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us.' He then said, 'Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment.' Abraham replied, 'They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them.' He said to them, 'No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent.' He said to him, 'If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead.'" This is the gospel of the Lord. So I want to start off by saying first thanks to Ashlyn for reading. You did a phenomenal job. We're very excited this year. Our crosswalk students, our confirmation students, will be participating more in our worship services, and we'll be doing some reading. So fabulous job. So thank you for that. So we are here together again, gathered together again, and it's wonderful to be with all of you. So this week I received an email, or a text message actually, from a friend, my friend Lyle. I really do have a friend named Lyle. We've been friends for about 11 years or so. We went through seminary together, and we have had a lot of adventures together. He's the same friend that I went out to California with about a year and a half ago or so. I've told some Lyle stories before, but have another one for you today. So he sent me this text message to tell me to read an article that he had written. He keeps a blog which he affectionately calls the Grumpy Pastor blog. And so he calls himself Grumpy Pastor, or GP for short. But he's not really that grumpy. He's actually a pretty nice guy. So he sent me this link to this article that he had written on his Grumpy Pastor blog. And so I read through the article and then stumbled across the following paragraph, which I'd like to read for you now. "Sometimes there is some simplicity that cuts through that multiple truth, muckety-muck of messiness." He has a way with words, you might say. Goes on. "A while back, one of GP's pastor buddies, Grumpy Pastor buddies, was a hospital chaplain on the south side of Chicago. This was at a level 1 trauma center with lots of gunshot victims that came into its ER. Grumpy Pastor asked him, 'With all of the gunshots coming in, how do you process it? What do you think about all of that death?' His answer was simple. 'People just forget that other people are children of God. If people simply treated others as children of God, it would all go away.'" So my first thought was, who's Lyle talking about? I wondered, who in the heck is that guy? Then I quickly realized, he's talking about me. I'm the one that had said that. I worked at this Trauma 1 facility, Christ Medical Center on the south side of Chicago for about a year in its ER. And I suddenly then remembered the conversation that we had where we talked about that. Our apartments in Chicago are very close to each other, and in those urban apartments, they often will have decks on the back. And so we would spend a lot of time talking about life, talking about family, theology, you name it. We would talk about it. We'd sit back on those decks as the night would fall and have lots and lots of conversations. And then I recalled that conversation where we ended up talking about and being in awe of the fact that all of us are children of God. And that can be a really challenging thing to think about. Everyone in this world is a child of God. Not just the people we like, but everyone. We are all God's children. And I think that's a really important message to hear, especially living in this time of anxiety that we're living in this world. Everywhere you go, it seems like there's anxiety. Anxiety is so thick sometimes you could cut it with a knife. Just this week, I received two people flicked me off as I was driving in the car. Anxiety is really high. On one occasion, I was driving along, and this guy was going about 15 miles an hour in a 30, and he had his head down like this. He was clearly texting and driving, and then he started to veer off in the other lane. This is last Sunday, and so I honked the horn to warn him, you're in the other lane. And all of a sudden, he swerved back into the proper lane. He looked behind, and he gave me the bird. He flicked me off. And then he realized I had my clergy collar on. I was going to a call. This is last Sunday. And you should have seen the look on his face. His eyes got really big. And I could tell just in his brain, he thought, I just flicked off a pastor. And then he started mouthing what I think was, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. Fast forward a couple days later, I'm at a four-way stop, and the person to the right of me has the right-of-way to go. We came to the four-way stop together, and so I was letting them go, but he really wanted me to go. And it was one of those, those fights you get at a four-way stop, and all of a sudden he just flicked me off. And then he went, and I thought, was that really necessary? And it's kind of funny to think about, but the anxiety is everywhere. It's really running rampant in our institutions, in our schools, in our churches, in our communities. Anxiety is everywhere. And I think we would do well to remember that we're all children of God, not just the people we like, but we are all children of God. Our text for today is a bit of a complicated text, and it's filled with all sorts of meaning and different ideas. But I want to tease out one theme in the text that really stood out to me after reading Grumpy Pastor's article, and that is the importance of treating one another as children of God, as the children of God that we all are. Clearly, the rich man was not doing that in our story for today. He was not treating Lazarus as a child of God. So in our story, we have this extremely wealthy man. He doesn't have a name. They just call him the rich man. In some translations, they translate it Dives, which is a Latin term. They give him the name Dives, which means a wealthy person, somebody with a lot of mammon or a lot of stuff, a lot of wealth. And so there's this rich man who wears very fine clothes. He has the finest linen outfits you can ever imagine, and linen was very, very expensive. I read somewhere that an ounce of linen would be worth the same as an ounce of gold in those days. So he was wearing some really fancy clothes. And he had purple as well. Wearing purple was kind of a sign of royalty because it was very hard to make purple dye. And some purple dyes were made out of mollusks, and that was the really expensive type of dye. That would be, as one translator put it, or as one theologian put it, that would be kind of like the Neiman Marcus dye. And then there was a different type of dye made out of plants that they used, and that would have been more the Kmart type of dye. But he had this really expensive type of dye made out of mollusks. So he had these fine purple clothes, and they were made of linen. This guy was extremely wealthy. And then he would throw these giant feasts where everybody feasted sumptuously. Isn't that a great word, sumptuously? It's kind of hard to say. But they'd have these massive feasts, and he would just put on a big show for everyone. So this guy was incredibly rich. He was living the sweet life. you might say. And then there was this guy, Lazarus. Lazarus was extremely poor. And Lazarus, the name Lazarus, is a derivative of Eliezer, which means something to the effect of God has helped. Isn't it ironic that that's his name? God has helped. Lazarus was extremely poor. He had sores all over his body. And the text talked about how even the dogs would come and lick his sores. And these weren't, typical house dogs. These were wild, rabid dogs that would come up to him. And he was so hungry that he just longed for crumbs from the rich man's table. So the story goes that the rich man dies and goes to Hades, where he is in agony. And the poor man, Lazarus, goes to be with Father Abraham. And it's not translated this way in our text, but if you look more at the Greek, it's the bosom of Abraham. And this is where you get that famous song. Have you heard that song? I'm going to sing it out of key, but I'll do my best. Rock of my soul in the bosom of Abraham, rock of my soul in the bosom of Abraham. I'll spare you any more singing. But that's where that song comes from. So Lazarus was with Abraham. He was in the front with Father Abraham at his side. And this story, this gospel story, is sad because the rich man never realized what was important until it was too late. He ignored Lazarus during his lifetime, and even in the afterlife, he thought of Lazarus as less than a human. He just thought of him as someone to order around. He asked Abraham to send Lazarus to bring water to him. When Abraham said there was no way to get across, the rich man wanted Abraham to order Lazarus to rise from the dead and warn his brothers to be nice people. This rich man was not bad because he had money, but because he allowed that money, that wealth, to blind him to the needs of others and to prevent him from seeing that we are all children of God. This story invites us all to think about how we treat the people around us. Do we treat them as children of God that they are? Or do we treat them poorly, or perhaps even ignore them like the rich man did? And it should make us think about who we are ignoring, because it is too painful to deal with them, or because we have written them off. I have always found that as I get closer to God, I also get closer to the people around me. It is harder to ignore the people around me or treat them badly when I let God in and I see my neighbor for the child of God that they are. And it's harder to let go of money, ego, or insecurities. It's hard to let all that get in the way, rather, when we get closer to God. So this story invites us to think about how we treat the people around us. We are called to remember that everyone is a child of God, no matter what. Doesn't matter if they're rich or poor or what type of clothes they wear. And it's amazing what happens when we remember that everybody around us is a child of God. All that stuff that gets put up, all of those barriers that we're not supposed to cross, all those barriers simply fade away. And I would argue every time that you see your neighbor as a child of God, amazing things happen every time. So after reading that article of Lyle's and thinking about this text, I started to think about a variety of things that happened to me in Chicago. Some things were not so good, and there were a lot of horrible things that I saw during my time there. But there was also some really amazing things as well. And whenever I would see someone as the child of God that they are, it was incredible to see how that relationship would develop. And I remember one story in particular. We had a young man named Richard who had been in a gang for a good chunk of his teenage years, and he got out of the gang, and he was able to move to a suburb. And that's a really challenging thing to do. When you're in a gang, you're kind of there to stay. And when you try to get out, bad things can happen sometimes. Anyway, he moved out to the suburb, and then he wanted to visit his mom, who still lived on the south side of Chicago. So he came in one night. Well, somehow people got wind that he had made it back into the neighborhood. And so a group of his former gang members sought him out, and they shot him multiple times, and he came into our ER. And one of the bullets severed his spinal cord, so he ended up being a quadriplegic. And so he spent a lot of time in our facility. And I befriended Richard. I got to know him pretty well, and that's not his real name, by the way. And I remember on several occasions going up there, and he just kind of ignored me. And he kind of even made fun of my Minnesota accent and all of those sorts of things. But eventually we started talking, and we started seeing each other as the children of God that we are. And we ended up having this amazing relationship. And we talked about life. I would share about my experiences growing up. He would share about his experiences as well. We joked, and we laughed, and we prayed, and we cried on many occasions while he was at our facility. And I even gave him a Bible that I had when I went to the youth gathering in 1994 in Atlanta, and gave him that Bible. I remember on my last day with him, he took my hand, and with tears in his eyes, he said, "Aaron, I love you like a brother." With tears in my eyes, I said, "I love you like a brother as well." Two completely different guys from two different sides of the tracks, you might say. And we were able to take hands. I was able to take his hand, rather, and just to say, "I love you like a brother." It was an amazing experience. That's what the kingdom of God looks like. And suddenly there was this amazing kinship between the two of us. Does it always happen that way? I would say yes, when you're willing to look at your neighbor as the child of God that they are. And I'm convinced that if we did more of that, a lot of this anxiety floating all around us would all drift away. I found out a few years later that Richard passed away, and I'm thankful for all that that young man taught me about life. And I'm thankful that he reminded me that we are all children of God simply by his presence. Both of us were willing to let each other in, and amazing things happened. That's kinship. That's God making a beautiful relationship, and for that I give thanks. So this text is not so much about who will go to hell or who will go to heaven. I see this text more as a wake-up call. God is calling us to wake up to his vision that all are children of God. And God wants us to take very seriously caring for each other. God calls us to feed our neighbors, clothe them, house them, heal them, and grant them what they need. You see, we are in this world together. And if only we could look at our neighbors as the children of God that they are, I'm convinced that much would be better in our life. But we get caught up in our stuff and the things of the world that prevent us from seeing our neighbors for the children of God that they are. In John 17, we read a great vision of Jesus. He says that they may all be one. He prays that we all may be one. This text is a call to all of us to take this vision seriously and to look to that day when there is no rich or poor, when there is simply one, and that is one family who are connected by the fact that we are all children of God. We, all of us, are God's children. We are his beloved daughters and sons. And this is really good news. Amen.